Okay, AP Gov guys, Mr. Walls, here to talk to you about the role of the media in in public policy and government. As you guys are probably aware, based on the fact that we get a different media briefing every day, whether you listen to the radio or you watch television. The United States government is consistently trying to educate Americans using the media. We can go back to Roosevelt's fireside chats. Kennedy did something similar. Roosevelt used this technique during the Depression into the war to kind of put people at ease, to kind of make people feel a little better. Now, obviously, media has changed since the time of Roosevelt. The media, the role is a bit confusing now. It's not quite as simple to understand as it was back in the day, because there are sort of agendas that are evolving as the media evolves or devolves, depending on your take. My take, devolve, complete and total devolution. But that's just me. Again, personal opinion. Let me just take a look at, first of all, you guys are aware that the First Amendment protects freedom of the press. Now, historically, the press, and I'm going way back through history, not, this is some AP Euro stuff. The press is the first thing that gets cracked down upon because the press is powerful. The revolutions of 1848 in Europe, when I talk to my AP Euro guys, are largely driven by the press. The governments back in the 1700s and 1800s, governments of Europe were very leery of the press and were very quick to crack down on the press. There wasn't really media back then, but it was the press, and the press represented the media. So there's a couple cases in America in which the media has been sort of cracked down on, or there was ambiguity as to what their rights were, and those court cases are pretty important. The first of those cases is 1931 Neer versus Minnesota, and this one deals with something called prior restraint. And prior restraint is a very important topic for the AP exam. Prior restraint is the government trying to keep something from being published. That's prior restraint. In the case of Neer versus Minnesota, you have a newspaper, the Saturday Press, which is sort of this anti-Semitic, anti-Catholic, one of those sort of Klan-based newspapers that is being shut down. And they in Neer versus Minnesota, 1931. They argue that the due process clause of the 5th and the 14th Amendments, which you're all very familiar with, are being violated. And in this particular case, the Supreme Court got their back. Prior restraint is not allowed. Now, this notion of prior restraint will come up again. Okay? Just keep an eye out. There's another issue that comes up in the media, and that is, the prior restraint issue is, does the press or the media have information that could be damaging to the United States as a whole, or could somebody's life be put in jeopardy if it were published? These are the things where prior restraint is going to be really tested. In the case of, Near's Saturday Press, he was just a nasty person. So the prior restraint really, there was no ability for the government to exercise prior restraint. A better case for prior restraint is the New York Times case, in which in 1973, they sued the U.S. government because they have something called the Pentagon Papers. The Pentagon Papers have been leaked to the New York Times, and they are papers that document the internal decision-making process in Vietnam, and for the most part, they are very damning in terms of perspective of the U.S. government. They are essentially a bunch of papers that say we have no chance of winning this war, and this is a disaster, and this is what it's going to require, and this, that, and the other thing. And the New York Times was like, we're publishing this. And the government was like, no, you're not publishing this. And in fact, the Supreme Court ruled, no, they can publish it. So prior restraint, this should show you that prior restraint is very difficult to exercise for the government, because the press is seen as, quote unquote, and this is a term, the gatekeeper. They're there to keep the government honest on a certain level. If you look at the Watergate process, it's the press that are the ones that are getting the information, because people need to feel there's an outlet that's a safe outlet. So if it's the government that is doing something malicious, okay, then how safe would you feel, or how effective would you feel going to the government with your information? That's ridiculous. If in 1972 you got information regarding possible CIA affiliation with the assassination of John F. Kennedy, you're not going to feel good going to the government with that information, possibly. I mean, you might. The press is a great place to go with your information, because the press is the gatekeeper. So when someone leaks the Pentagon Papers to the press, it is seen, and this is, the First Amendment and the Fifth and the 14th Amendment with their due process elements, First Amendment with the freedom of the press. This is something that we hold dear as a country. So in 1973, when the Pentagon Papers are leaked to the New York Times and the government tries to prohibit them from being released, it's like, no deal. No, that's unconstitutional. And the New York Times releases the Pentagon Papers, and the Pentagon Papers play a major role in the policy making from that point forward. So, couple other cases: Hazelwood versus Kuhlmeyer in 1988, in which a St. Louis school newspaper was going to publish articles on things like teen pregnancy and divorce, and the school stepped in and said, no, you're not going to publish things like this that are of a sensitive nature. And in this particular case, in 1988, the Supreme Court says that the school district can, in fact, censor to some extent, because there have to, as long as there are legitimate concerns by the school, they can censor it. Because here's one of the things we don't want to happen with a school newspaper. When you're dealing with kids, there's a different bar. And so when you're dealing with a school newspaper, there's going to be a different bar. And that bar is going to account for the possibility of, these are kids, and if damage occurs, something malicious is said or something that hurts a given community, you can't risk that with a school newspaper. These are the kinds of things that where like a prior restraint is going to have a gray area. And it's like, hey, look, the schools can censor this because if this is something that could hurt kids or could, on an emotional level, I don't think any school paper is advocating like rebellion. But that would definitely be something that the school could step in and censor. But for the most part, it's a different bar when it comes to kids. And that bar accounts for what would the parents and the families in the community, how would they feel? And that's important. So Hazelwood versus Kuhlmeyer, we do see that, yes, school newspapers can be censored to some extent. And this brings up the question, there's two types of due process, because prior restraint is a due process question. And there's, substantive due process, which is, does the law as it's written provide due process? And then there's procedural due process. And that is, does the policy of enacting a law violate due process? And so, for example, when you, a drug dealer, the drugs are illegal, but there's the procedure of busting a drug dealer, a procedural due process, must be adhered to. Okay? And then there's laws that are deemed, laws that aren't justified. When you pass a law, and the Supreme Court may rule that there's the law itself violates due process. And maybe that is something, if you passed a law that was that said, hey, all news media must be vetted by a state official. Okay, that law has already violated due process. So, that's substantive due process. And it's like, no, the law itself violates due process, whereas procedural, we see a lot of procedural due process cases. Anyway, let's get to some of the things that this gatekeeper, the media, is supposed to do. Inform the public. Every morning, you are probably waking up and you are taking a look at the news. Now, we live in an age where, and remember something, news is typically a for-profit enterprise. That's important. And it always, pretty much in America, has been a for-profit enterprise. I remember when the Rocky Mountain News and the Denver Post both existed. And when they were going to merge into one, the primary concern was, how are we going to get a multitude of perspectives? The more you shrink the avenue that you have with media, the less perspective you're getting. And so when a business, this light is driving me crazy. So when there's a business decision like the Denver Post and Rocky Mountain News merging, there is a concern that the public, one of the most important, roles of the media is to inform the public. So there was a concern when those two merged that the public's information needs would take a hit. And that's a legitimate concern, because remember something, they're for profit. So editorial elements are going to be in there. There are going to be biases. There's just no way around that. These are humans creating a paper. So there are going to be biases. So that's why today, when I wake up and read the news, I will read the New York Times, which very clearly has a liberal tint to it. I don't even think they would deny that. I will then read something like Bloomberg. I will read a more conservative take. I'll take a look at some of the more Fox-related type perspectives on Drudge Report. So I'll try and get a perspective that factors in all sides. I think that's really important. And the better news sources to me are news sources that are like The Economist, who look at everything from a fiscal and, well, that's not true, but from an economics standpoint. And so they tend to be, to me, a lot less biased. There's a lot less bias in there. So informing the public is important. And one of the issues that we're running into now is the fact that we have news sources that you have to use a multitude of news sources to try and find the middle. Okay? Sharing public opinion is very important. We have to have these editorials. We have to have letters and comment areas. These are things that kind of let the public have a voice. And this is getting... The problem is that we're kind of at a point where the public has so much voice that it's diluting our ability to get to the real factual voices, because one of the first things they would probably teach you in journalism school is that, the Twitter and, Snapchat and Facebook and these various internet sources are, have become so diluted with voices that it's very difficult to get a true feeling from them, because we don't know how much of the population is really chiming in on this stuff. So, but sharing public opinion is very important. The news is the link between the citizens and the government. It is a watchdog, and the Pentagon Papers and Watergate, which is the Washington Post. These are landmark cases in which the press. Oh, and by the way, MK. Have you guys heard of MK Ultra? It was a program in the 50s and 60s in which the government was some crazy stuff, man, like giving LSD to people and trying to see if they could turn them into mechanical killers. And this is real stuff, because the New York Times were the ones that broke this in the 70s. I don't know when it was, but the New York Times broke the MK Ultra thing. Look up MK Ultra, man. If you're I was just listening to a podcast with Joe Rogan and this guy O'Neill, who wrote this book about it, and it's if the stuff and this dude's pretty legit, because I did some research on it, but apparently Charles Manson was part of the whole MK Ultra program, and you got to listen to that podcast. It's a trip. This guy wrote this book, and he's an investigative reporter. He's a journalist. Haynes Johnson, journalist, wrote a book called Sleepwalking Through History about the Reagan era. It's one of the most fascinating books I've ever read. So this is just, I know I'm ranting a little, but where are you going? I'm ranting a little, but this is the role of journalists, to uncover this stuff. And you won't believe, there are programs within the government that you can't believe existed. We've talked about in Haynes Johnson's book, Sleepwalking Through History, we've talked about the government selling, and this is documented stuff by news organizations selling, crack cocaine with it to fund Contra wars in Central and South America. The government can get a little out of control, kids. And so, in that case, the media plays a vital role, or I guess the media kind of reels in the government, and I think every time there's something kind of shady within the government is thinking, if this gets out, if this gets leaked, that's a very important task, that watchdog task, and agenda setting. It's, the media, as you're seeing now with this COVID, the media will have an agenda and push an agenda. Now, sometimes that's okay, if you know that it's an agenda. There are socialist newspapers, there are conservative newspapers, there are liberal newspapers. We know there's an agenda, and that agenda might have something to do with a given national political issue. That's of tremendous significance. So that's an important part. Vietnam is probably the classic example of this. But because we had a lot of the news media, the Walter Cronkite at the Tet Offensive, Walter Cronkite was sort of this guy who was this bastion of Edward Murrow, Walter Cronkite, Ted Koppel. These guys were like these respected newsmen. It was a different era in news. We don't really have a whole lot of respect for the news media now. I mean, we see it as, it's there, but there aren't the characters like Cronkite, who actually lived next door to two houses down from my parents in Martha's Vineyard. Amazing house. Anyway, that was a kind of a different era. But Cronkite at the Tet Offensive, we can't win this war. He's standing there. Despite the fact that we were able to win the Tet Offensive, no problem. I mean, it just looked really bad. But that's news. That is the moment that America turned. That Walter Cronkite standing there saying we can't win this war. That's the moment America turned on the Vietnam conflict. And so that's the power of the media. New York Times with the Pentagon Papers, Nixon's Watergate and New York Times. I mean, that is these are quintessential moments in policy. And so they can become policy, makers. They're certainly policy influencers. The Federal Communications Act of 1934 created the FCC. Okay? Federal Communications Act of 1934, you're going to want to know that because the FCC is the agency that monitors all media. I remember when I was a kid listening to Howard Stern and the FCC consistently fining him. There was the famous Super Bowl halftime show with Justin Timberlake and Janet Jackson, where her wardrobe malfunctioned, and the FCC again was on top of that. If you hear someone, on the news, there's some amazing bloopers on the news. I love listening to news bloopers because they usually involve something just hideous, like something really funny. But if you hear one of those bloopers, you'll immediately hear an apology. And that apology is there to tell the FCC, it's not really for the people. I don't know many people that get offended by a blooper, but unless it's something like really, like someone's going to lose a job, type of thing. But if it's just like a cuss word or something, it's usually when they apologize, it's like, oh, I'm sorry, did not know I was on the air. And that is for the FCC. And Federal Communication Commission, there are structural regulations, the 1996 Telecommunications Act, okay? And that was there to address ownership, I believe. I'm not sure. I think it's an ownership thing, 1996 Telecommunications Act. I believe it goes after the owners and makes sure the owners of newspapers don't have a crazy agenda. Look up that 96 Telecommunications Act and be aware of that. Remember that news is sort of a self-regulating thing. And that's an editorial or an editor. Those are editors. And the editor is a really important position because the editor has to look at the notion of defamation. Now, I talked about New York Times versus Sullivan. I might not have finished that. New York Times versus Sullivan, which is 64, in which the Sullivan had sued the New York Times for defamation. He was like a politician of some sort, and it's important to note that in that case, the Supreme Court ruled that if you are a public figure, you don't have the rights to sue for defamation that an average American has. So if the New York Times were to print something about you, you could sue for defamation of character or libel. If the New York Times prints something about me, I am something of a public figure, not a politician, but I have brought some spotlight upon myself. That's the measure. Is, does this person willingly put themselves into the spotlight? And that's a politician, a public figure. And there are varying degrees of public figures. If you're not a public figure, all defamation and libel laws apply. But in the Sullivan case with New York Times, he was a public figure, and the New York Times was not. He could not sue them for defamation in that case. You can sue a newspaper for defamation if they knowingly print something that defames your character that is false. Now, if that's why they'll always say the alleged, participant. That's the key to the defamation issue. Allegedly. That's the key. You'll see that all the time in the news media. So they are gatekeepers. Okay? I'm at 27 minutes. So I'm going to leave you with this, and I am going to, I'll put this in there with an assignment for you, and you guys take your dog for a long walk and listen to this and learn a little something. Okay? And soon we're getting to the point where we're almost at the point where I just start doing review sessions for that exam. Anyway, there is something I want from you. Oh, I'll put it in your assignment thing, and it's going to involve your review book. So you're going to be taking a practice test at your own pace. Anyway, peace.